The first thing I noticed about the office wasn't the polished wood or the expensive furniture. It was the silence. The kind of silence that felt deliberate, as though even the ticking of the clock had been trained not to disturb the air. I had been nervous enough walking into the building, rehearsing answers in my head, but stepping into that room made me feel as if every thought I'd ever had suddenly grew too loud. Mr. Harrow sat behind the desk, perfectly still, the light from the window falling across his face at an angle that made him look both severe and strangely vulnerable. He wasn't young, his hair was flecked with silver and there were lines at the corners of his eyes, but something about him drew me in immediately. Maybe it was the way he didn't rush me, didn't force me to sit down. He just looked at me, his gaze level, unblinking. I closed the door behind me and the sound echoed, sharper than it should have. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, suddenly aware of how out of place I felt in my cheap jacket, the one I'd ironed twice that morning in an attempt to make it look newer than it was. "Sit," he said finally, his voice low, smooth but with an edge of something unreadable. I obeyed, lowering myself into the chair across from his desk. The leather was cool against my palms. I tried to sit straight, but the weight of his gaze made me shift, like he could see through every posture I tried to adopt. He picked up my resume, though I suspected he'd already read it, and let the silence stretch before speaking again. "You've done a little of everything," he said, scanning the page. "Retail. A few temp jobs. Some writing." He glanced up at me then as if testing whether I'd flinch. "I've been figuring things out," I admitted, hating how small my voice sounded in that room. There was no reaction on his face, only the faintest lift of an eyebrow. "And you thought you'd figure them out here?" It wasn't a cruel question, but it landed with more weight than I expected. My throat tightened. "I thought I could try." His eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. "I like honesty," he said at last. "Most people don't know how to use it." Something in me loosened, though not enough to relax. I shifted in my seat and for a second, his gaze followed the movement of my hands. My fingers curled into fists against my knees as if caught. He began asking me questions, the kind you'd expect in an interview, but somehow they felt different when he asked them. Each one seemed to strip away a layer of the version of myself I usually showed strangers. He didn't ask about my strengths, not directly. He asked about what I avoided, what I thought I was running from. And I found myself answering, almost against my will. At one point, I tried to look away, to fix my eyes on the bookshelf behind him, the neat rows of leather-bound volumes that looked more decorative than read. But his voice pulled me back every time. "Do you always fidget when you're uncertain?" he asked quietly, almost as if he were noting it to himself. Heat rushed to my face. I hadn't realized I was twisting my fingers together in my lap. I forced them still. "I guess I do." A flicker, not quite a smile but something like it, passed across his mouth. "Interesting." The word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. Minutes stretched, or maybe they collapsed. Time in that office felt unreliable. I was caught between wanting to leave and wanting to know what else he'd notice about me if I stayed. When he finally stood, it startled me. The chair scraped softly against the floor, and his height seemed even more imposing when he stepped around the desk. I expected him to gesture to the door, to signal that the interview was over. Instead, he walked closer, his footsteps unhurried, deliberate. I rose to meet him, though my legs felt uncertain. For a moment, we stood only a few feet apart, and I could see details I hadn't before. The faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his shirt clung at his shoulders, the faint trace of cologne that seemed at once sharp and warm. He reached the door, his hand on the handle. Relief rushed through me, and then froze when I heard the click. He had locked it. The sound was soft, almost casual, but it echoed in me like thunder. My chest tightened. I glanced at him, but he didn't look menacing, didn't move closer. He just turned the key with an ease that suggested habit. When his eyes found mine again, there was no threat there, no explanation either. Only a question I couldn't name. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I should have spoken, asked why, demanded something, but the words never came. Instead, the silence pressed down on us again, thicker than before, filled with all the things neither of us said. And in that silence, with the door locked behind me, I felt a shift, as though the interview I thought I was here for had ended, and something else entirely had begun. The click of the lock still echoed in my chest long after the sound had faded. I stood there, unsure if I should step back or forward, my breath shallow like I'd been caught trespassing in a place I didn't belong. Mr. Harrow didn't seem rushed. He slid the key back into his pocket, then glanced at me with an expression so unreadable it made me restless. He didn't explain and I didn't ask. Instead, he walked past me with a quiet, assured ease and crossed back to his desk. "Drink?" he asked as if this were nothing unusual. I nodded before I could think. My throat was dry anyway. He reached into a cabinet, pulling out a decanter of something amber, pouring it into 2 short glasses. The liquid caught the light, burning gold. When he handed me the glass, our fingers brushed. It was nothing, a second of contact, barely a graze, but it felt like being touched where no one ever had before. My grip tightened around the cool glass as if that could ground me. He loosened his tie, sliding it free with one slow pull. The sound of fabric moving against fabric seemed louder than it should have. My eyes caught on the hollow of his throat, the open collar of his shirt, the faint sheen of skin revealed. I forced myself to look away, but the image lingered. We sat opposite each other, the desk no longer feeling like a barrier, just a thin stretch of wood that failed to dilute the charge in the room. I took a sip. The drink was sharp, burning down my throat, making my pulse race faster than it already was. "You don't seem like the kind of man who knows what he wants," Harrow said finally, his voice even though his words cut clean. Heat rushed to my face. I do. Sometimes. Sometimes, he repeated, tasting the word, letting it hang. I hated that he was right. Hated that I couldn't summon something strong to throw back at him. The truth was I didn't know what I wanted, not fully, not in the ways that mattered most. The silence stretched again, heavy but not uncomfortable, just thick, like the air itself had weight. He leaned back in his chair, rolling the glass between his fingers, watching me over the rim. I tried to fill the space with words. "What about you? Did you always know what you wanted?" His eyes flickered, as if my question touched something he hadn't planned to reveal. He took a slow drink, then set the glass down carefully. "I learned to stop wanting things a long time ago." The way he said it made me ache in a place I didn't know I had. I wanted to ask more, but his expression told me he wouldn't answer. So instead, we traded smaller pieces of ourselves, safer ones. He asked about my family. I told him I hadn't spoken to my father in months. He nodded like he understood without needing to say why. He told me he worked late most nights because the quiet suited him. Somewhere in the middle of all that, the clock seemed to lose its hold on us. It didn't feel like an interview anymore. It felt like something else, like stepping into a conversation that had been waiting for me long before I arrived. The air shifted when I reached for my glass again and his hand brushed mine a second time. This time it wasn't an accident, or if it was, neither of us moved away quickly enough to make it so. The warmth of his skin against mine was fleeting, but it sent a shock through me that made my chest tighten. I pulled back first, fingers trembling against the cool glass. He didn't comment, but his gaze followed the retreat, steady, patient, as though he could see every thought I tried to hide. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with what he didn't say, what I didn't dare say either. I stared at the liquid in my glass, but all I could feel was the echo of that touch, the heat of his nearness even from across the desk. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I knew he could see it, even if he didn't point it out this time. I wanted to speak, to ask why he locked the door, to ask if this was still an interview or something else entirely. But the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I sat there, drowning in the quiet, knowing something had shifted. And when I looked up, he was still watching me, not with cruelty, not even with expectation. Just with a kind of focus that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. I held his gaze for as long as I could. And when I finally looked away, the air between us felt like it had already changed, even if neither of us would admit it. The night outside the windows had deepened, the office now lit only by the amber lamps that cast long shadows against the walls. I could hear the faint hum of the city beyond, muffled and distant, as though the world had forgotten this room existed. Harrow sat across from me, shoulders relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before. The tie was gone, his top button undone, and with that small unraveling he looked less like a boss and more like a man. A man who, for the first time that night, seemed almost humanly tired. "I stay late most evenings," he said suddenly, his voice quieter than before, carrying something it hadn't earlier. "It's easier than going back to an empty apartment." His words hung in the air and I didn't know how to respond. I studied his face, the way his eyes softened when he admitted it, the faint crease between his brows that spoke of years of silence stacked on silence. Before I realized what I was doing, my hand moved across the desk. A simple gesture, instinctive. My fingers rested lightly on his forearm just above his wrist. The fabric of his shirt was warm beneath my touch, the pulse steady and real beneath. I should have pulled back instantly. Instead, I stayed there, suspended in the strange safety of that contact. He looked at my hand, then at me. His eyes caught mine, and for a moment the world slowed to a crawl. Everything sharpened, the faint hum of electricity in the lamp, the soft rasp of our breathing, the way the air seemed to thicken between us. His gaze locked on mine with a steadiness that unsettled me. I couldn't move. My chest tightened, my hand trembling slightly against his arm, but I didn't withdraw. He didn't either. The silence was unbearable, and yet I didn't want it to break. There was no smirk, no warning in his expression, just a quiet searching, like he was waiting for me to understand something without him saying it. And maybe I did. Maybe that was what scared me most. When I finally pulled my hand back, the absence of touch felt louder than the contact itself had been. My fingers tingled where they'd been pressed to his sleeve, as though the heat had branded me. Neither of us spoke. I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing, but I was too aware of him now. The angle of his jaw, the faint lines at his temples, the way his lips parted slightly as though he was about to speak but chose not to. The air between us pulsed with everything unsaid. I told myself it was just a moment, a fleeting slip. But the truth was, it didn't feel accidental. It felt inevitable. The clock ticked softly on the wall, though I couldn't tell how much time had passed. Seconds, minutes, they all blurred. All I knew was the weight of his eyes, the pull I felt but couldn't name. I wanted to ask what he was thinking, wanted to demand why he let me touch him, why he didn't pull away. But my voice betrayed me, caught somewhere between fear and something dangerously close to longing. Instead, I sat in that charged silence, caught between retreat and surrender. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You surprise me." The words landed heavier than they should have. I didn't ask what he meant. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The silence stretched again, and this time it felt like a thread drawn taut between us, fragile but unbreakable. I shifted slightly in my seat, but it didn't ease the weight in my chest. I could feel it, something building, pressing, waiting for release. And then his eyes found mine again, and everything else, the office, the city, the reason I'd come here, fell away. It was just him. Just me. And the moment that froze us both, hanging in the space between. The silence stretched so thin it felt like it might snap. My chest was tight, my palms damp against my thighs. Harrow hadn't moved since he said those words, "You surprise me," and I hadn't either. We sat there, two statues caught in the kind of moment that could end everything or change it completely. Finally I forced a laugh, weak, trembling, but the only sound I could muster. Is this still an interview?" His expression shifted, not quite a smile, not quite serious, something caught in between. "That depends," he said softly. "What do you think you're here for?" My heart hammered so loudly I thought he must hear it. I wanted to answer, to brush it off with something clever, but all I managed was a shaky, "I don't know anymore." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk, his gaze steady. Most people walk into this office pretending. Pretending they're confident, pretending they're certain. You don't pretend very well. The words should have stung, but they didn't. They felt disarming. Like he'd seen something in me I hadn't even dared name myself. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Maybe I don't know how. He studied me for a long moment. The lamp cast shadows across his face, softening the lines, making him look almost weary. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. My fingers tightened around the glass still in my hand, though I hadn't taken a sip in minutes. My mouth worked before my courage did. "Can I ask you something?" His head tilted slightly. "You can." "Why did you lock the door?" The question hung there, heavier than it should have been. His eyes didn't flinch. He sat back slowly, exhaling through his nose. "Because I didn't want anyone walking in." "That's not an answer," I whispered. His gaze held mine, unwavering. "No, it isn't." The silence after that was different. It wasn't empty, it was full, brimming, dangerous. Something inside me broke then, some dam I'd been holding all my life. The words came out before I could stop them. I don't usually feel like this." His brow furrowed just slightly. "Like what?" I shook my head, staring at the amber liquid in my glass, afraid to look at him. "Like my whole body is awake. Like I'm afraid of what I want. Afraid you'll see it." The confession tasted raw, like tearing open skin. I braced myself for rejection, for laughter, for that slow shake of the head that would undo me completely. But none of that came. Instead, he spoke so quietly I almost missed it. "What if I've already seen it?" My head snapped up. His eyes were on me, not cruel, not smug. Just open, unbearably open. And in that gaze I saw it. The thing he hadn't been saying all night, the thing I'd been too afraid to name. My breath caught. "Then, what do we do?" The faintest ghost of a smile touched his lips, and for the first time since I'd walked into the office, he looked almost uncertain. "That depends," he said. "What if you said yes?" The words hollowed me out, left me trembling. "Yes to what?" I wanted to ask, but I knew. Deep down I knew. I pushed the glass aside with unsteady fingers because my hands needed to do something, anything. My voice was barely audible when I spoke. I don't know how. His chair creaked softly as he rose. My pulse spiked as he rounded the desk, his footsteps measured, deliberate, until he stood just a step away from me. You don't have to know how, he said, his voice low, careful. You just have to not run. I tilted my face up toward him, every muscle taut, my breath shallow. I couldn't look away if I tried. He raised a hand slowly, giving me every chance to move. His fingers brushed my cheek, tentative, almost hesitant, and the warmth of his skin against mine unraveled me completely. I didn't move. I didn't run. The room tilted, time slowed. His touch lingered, thumb grazing lightly across my cheekbone. My lips parted without thought, my body betraying me, leaning infinitesimally closer. When he bent down, his forehead nearly touching mine, I could smell the faint trace of cologne, the warmth of whiskey on his breath. He paused there, waiting, giving me the choice. My heart roared in my ears. I was terrified, trembling, but every nerve in me screamed not to let this moment pass. So I closed the distance. The kiss was clumsy at first, trembling, unsure. Just a brush of lips, fleeting and fragile. But it was real. My chest ached with it. He drew back slightly, searching my face as if to ask if I regretted it. I didn't. I leaned in again, firmer this time, though my whole body shook with the risk of it. His lips pressed back against mine, slow and certain, and I felt something in me break open, something I hadn't let myself touch in years, maybe ever. When we finally parted, the silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was softer now, filled with something fragile but alive. I lowered my gaze, afraid my eyes would give away too much. I don't know what this means, I whispered. Neither did he. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his breath came slower. But his hand was still on my face, steady, grounding. It means, he said quietly, that we don't have to pretend tonight. The words settled in me like a promise, fragile and terrifying, but one I couldn't bring myself to turn away from. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I let myself breathe. The kiss lingered in the air long after our lips had parted. My skin still buzzed where his hand had cupped my face, and my breath came shallow, unsteady. I sat there waiting for the weight of what we'd done to crush me. But it didn't. Instead, a strange lightness filled the room, as if the air itself had shifted, softer somehow. Harrow lowered himself into the chair beside me, not back behind the desk where he had started. The change was subtle but enormous. He was no longer a figure of authority towering across polished wood. He was just a man sitting close enough that our shoulders almost brushed. For a long time neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't sharp anymore. It had edges rounded by something gentler. Finally, I exhaled a shaky laugh. That was probably not in the employee handbook. His mouth curved into the faintest smile. We don't really have a handbook. The simplicity of it broke something open in me, and laughter slipped out before I could stop it. Real, unguarded laughter. It startled me as much as it seemed to surprise him. He leaned back slightly, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, soft, amused but still cautious, like he wasn't sure if the ground beneath us was solid yet. You're shaking, he said quietly. I know, I admitted, staring at my hands. I feel like I should be terrified, but I'm not. Not exactly. It's more like, I search for the words. Like I've been holding my breath for years and I finally let it out. His gaze softened, the faint lines at his eyes deepening. That sounds about right. Our shoulders brushed then, a tiny point of contact that sent another ripple through me. Neither of us moved away. We talked after that, not about what had just happened but about smaller things. He told me how he'd once dreamed of teaching history before ending up here. I told him about the stories I used to write in notebooks when I was a kid, how I'd hidden them under my mattress so no one would find them. It was strange how easily the words came once the weight of silence had broken. Strange how his voice no longer sounded like judgment but like confession. At one point, he teased me about the way I'd stumbled over my answers earlier, and I shoved his shoulder lightly in return. The contact was brief but it left me warm. We laughed more than I expected. The sound filled the office in a way that made the place feel different. Less like a cage, more like a room that had been waiting all along to hold this. But even in the lightness, I felt the fragility. Every laugh, every glance, was edged with the awareness of what we weren't saying. What now? What happens after this? As if reading my thoughts, Harrow finally asked, So, where do we go from here? I froze, the question hanging between us like a tightrope. I don't know, I admitted. I don't even know if I'm supposed to be here if this, I gestured vaguely between us, my voice trembling, is something real or just a moment. He was quiet for a long beat, eyes steady on mine. Sometimes a moment is enough, he said finally. Sometimes it's the only way something real begins. The words sank deep, unsettling and comforting all at once. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to stay in that fragile space a little longer, suspended between fear and hope. So I didn't move. Neither did he. We sat there, close enough to feel each other's warmth, trading small stories, small smiles as the night deepened around us. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to leave. I must have drifted off at some point because when I opened my eyes, the office was filled with dawn. Pale light spilled through the blinds, cutting the room into stripes of gold and shadow. My neck ached from the chair I'd slumped in, but I didn't care. What I noticed first wasn't the light, but him. Harrow was still there, seated not far from me, head bowed slightly as if he too had dozed off and woken early. His tie lay forgotten on the desk, his shirt slightly rumpled, and the sight of him like that, unguarded, softened by the morning, stirred something in me I couldn't name. For a moment I just watched. The lines of his face seemed different in daylight, less severe, more human. I thought of the man who had asked sharp questions hours ago, the man who had kissed me like he wasn't sure he was allowed to want to. And now here he was, still close, still present. He stirred, lifting his head, eyes meeting mine. There was no jolt, no awkward scramble to cover what had passed between us. Just a slow exhale, as if relief had been waiting for the morning too. "You stayed," he said, voice rough with sleep. "I did," I murmured, my throat dry but steady. A small nod. He reached for the decanter on the desk but stopped, reconsidered, and instead poured steaming coffee from a carafe I hadn't noticed before. He slid one of the mugs toward me. Our fingers brushed again, deliberate this time. I wrapped my hands around the mug, grateful for its warmth, for the ordinary act of sharing something as simple as coffee. The simplicity grounded me, made everything that had happened feel less like a fever dream and more like something quietly real. We drank in silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of ceramic, the faint hum of the city waking beyond the walls. At one point, his hand moved across the desk, palm open. It wasn't a command or a demand, just an offering. My chest tightened. I hesitated, staring at his hand, at the fine lines in his skin, the quiet patience in the gesture. Then I placed mine in his. The contact was steady, warm, nothing hurried or reckless. Just presence. His thumb traced lightly along my knuckles, and I felt my breath steady, as if my body had been waiting for this small anchor all along. We didn't speak of last night. We didn't need to. The silence said enough. Softer now, filled not with fear but with something almost like peace. I thought of how I'd come here looking for a job, how I'd walked into this office rehearsing answers about ambition and skills I barely believed I had. And yet, somehow, I was leaving with something I hadn't even thought to look for. Something infinitely more uncertain. Something infinitely more alive. Harrow met my eyes again, and for the first time, there was no trace of the boss in his gaze. Just a man, tired but hopeful, asking without words if I was still here, still willing. I gave the smallest nod. And in that quiet morning light, with coffee cooling in our hands and the city stretching awake outside, I understood. Whatever this was, whatever came next, it had already begun. Something real.